Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show, we have Olivia Ong. She is a pain and rehabilitation physician in Australia, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, The Unspoken Pandemic in Frontline Healthcare Workers. Olivia, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for having me.
We'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
So I graduated from the University of Melbourne here in Australia in 2004, and I started my internship at a regional Victorian hospital. I entered the rehabilitation medicine training program as a resident in 2007. But in 2008, my life changed forever. I was walking to work when I was hit by a car at high speed in the hospital car park that I worked in. And as you can imagine, it changed everything. And you see, a few years earlier in my late 20s, when I was a resident, I had ticked all the success boxes. I was working as a resident doctor in a reputable hospital. I was happily married, still happily married. I had my own house and car, and I had a great network of friends. But in reality, at that time, I didn't feel fulfilled at all. I lacked self-worth. I was feeling quite burnt out. And we're hearing this more and more lately, aren't we? Like so many people who seemingly have it all, just lack self-worth. I was about to go on a journey of discovery. But first of all, I had to deal with my injury at that time. Because of the car accident, I had a spinal cord injury. I lost the ability to walk. And being a patient on the other side of the healthcare system, the days in the hospital were challenging and an eye-opener for me. I felt like a pincushion. It was really different being a patient. I finally understood what my patients had to go through. I felt like a pincushion, drips on my arms. I had a catheter, I had a feeding tube up my nose. I felt quite vulnerable. And I think the really most confronting thing I had to deal with was that I was told by doctors that I'll never walk again. Mm-hmm. So I was on the other side of the healthcare system. So for months after I had emergency spinal surgery to stabilize my spine. I basically had a L1 and L2 dislocation with smashed L2 vertebrae. So I had emergency spinal fusion surgery that night. And I remember, the days in the hospital. Every day I tried to move my legs. I was in spinal shock at that time. I just couldn't. So I used all my willpower, day in, day out, and tried my best to move my legs. When I couldn't, I just felt so defeated, very broken and helpless. And I finally understood, this is what my patients had to go through. That's not a nice feeling. And I felt such intense grief and loss following my injury because I asked all these questions were running through my head day in, day out. Like, will I be able to walk again? Will I ever be a doctor? Because that was all I knew. Like, that was my identity. I felt like a burden to my husband. Like, will he just leave me? And will I ever have children? If anyone has suffered a loss or been through a traumatic event, it's quite easy to blame yourself for your accident. And certainly that's what I did. I blamed myself for everything I went through. I felt that everyone was looking at me with pity. Basically, I wasn't being self-compassionate. And my self-worth, was already low at that point. When I was a resident, this is pre-injury, it plummeted to the bottom. And the good news is I eventually learned to walk again against all odds. In fact, I traveled to the United States in San Diego to learn to walk again. I spent a couple of years there and I really had an awesome time in the US, hanging out with spinal cord injury survivors. They took me to watch football games and we had tailgate parties. So I got to know all that stuff. And Thanksgiving, my journey to walk again taught me a very important life lesson: self-compassion. You see, my experience to learn to walk again was the exact opposite of my life as a resident doctor. Instead of being on autopilot, wishing that I had a catheter to not think about going to the bathroom. Yeah, that's how dramatic it was when I was a resident. I wished I had a catheter that I wouldn't have to go and to the bathroom. As we know, ward rounds are really very tight in terms of time. We have to do our charts and everything. And I had to be mindful of each step I took. I had to learn to crawl again, stand again like a baby, eventually walk again. And instead of being a lone ranger struggling to seek help, like us doctors do, I connected with fellow spinal cord injury survivors. We were bound together by our common humanity and our common suffering, being spinal cord injury. I guess most important of all, instead of being a perfectionist, beating myself up for every mistake I made, I learned to accept myself for who I was. And the three pillars of self-compassion, which I tell all my colleagues, I teach all my clients, it's and patience, it's mindfulness, common humanity, and self-acceptance. These are the three pillars. And these were the things that gave me self-worth. And actually, there's been research to show that self-compassion can help us become more productive, in fact. Not only allows us to remain calm in the face of failure, rejection, and criticism, we experience more higher well-being, become more productive and successful. It also reduces our stress levels as it activates our soothing system. We feel just a lot, greater well-being. And then as I learned to apply self-compassion in not only my personal life, in my professional life, I started getting my self-worth back. I went on to pass 2 board exams in rehabilitation medicine and pain medicine. I did end up having 2 children, very beautiful kids. I really adore them very much. And I essentially built a beautiful life from something that was really traumatic and sad. I became a formidable force in the lives of my family and friends, became more influential around my medical colleagues. They were initially very skeptical of me because I took time off from my work and they thought my medical knowledge has dropped. And, us doctors, unfortunately, can be quite judgmental towards each other. But they learned to respect me in the end. And I think the most important life lesson was that I learned to respect myself. And now every day I embody self-compassion in my clinical practice and also in because now I'm a life coach for doctors who are burnt out. So I try to teach them what self-compassion can do to help them recover from burnout.
Well, that's certainly an incredible story. And during that journey, who did you have to mentor you or guide you? How did you learn to have self-compassion? Was there someone who mentored you? Was this something that you had to find out on your own? How did you learn how to do this?
That's a good question to ask, Kevin, because it was mainly a journey of self-discovery.
Mm-hmm.
There was no one to mentor me. I felt very isolated from my medical colleagues. I felt quite rejected and discriminated because now I have a disability and I'm now working in a hospital like them. And there were many instances where, I remember one of my bosses made it really difficult for me to go to when I was back at work. I started part-time. And even though the other supervisors were pretty happy with my work performance, he told me off and said, I think your knowledge is really there's a big gap now. And I don't think you're competent enough to perform your duties. That's what he told me face front. And that's when I know that there's a lot of unconscious bias in our medical profession towards doctors with a disability and doctors with chronic illnesses. And I think eventually I got a life coach for myself, and that really helped me kind of overcome all the mental roadblocks I had. And suddenly, with the spinal cord injury survivors that I connected with, they were kind of like my gurus and mentors and peers at the same time. So we lean in on each other very much. And quite a number of them are still they're in the US, and we still stay connected up to this day because it's a common bond that binds us forever, in a way. Yeah.
Now, for those other clinicians who have chronic illness or disability, what would you say is your number one tip that you could share with them?
Pre-injury, I was programmed like a Lone Ranger, and I thought self-compassion was really fluffy and meaningless concept to even, I guess, embody. And having found the strength and power in self-compassion, which leads to balance and fulfillment, that's probably why that's the lesson that I want to kind of teach your audience, and that it's not fluffy, it's something within us that we can tap into. And especially with doctors who have, chronic illnesses and disabilities, that's, like everyday work in medicine is already quite a high clinical load and very stressful. Add a chronic illness or disability on top of that, you can imagine what it can do to your mental health and your well-being. And certainly I experienced burnout. Probably in 2019, I experienced full burnout from having to deal with my injury. I think I had board exams at that time. I had a toddler. Yeah, it was really a lot to juggle, and I experienced a very severe burnout experience that I had to take 2 months off work. So my message is, self-compassion is not one of those things that it's really easy to practice. It's intellectually easy to understand, but hard to practice. And I really want to tell doctors in a similar position like me, it's, with my own experience, it was really difficult and scary, because it's like giving ourselves love, right? Like sometimes we remember all the conditions under which we were unloved. And when we open to our pain, and feelings with repressed for a lifetime can rise up and overwhelm us. And certainly as doctors, we repress our emotions big time. And I remember Chris Gelmer from the Mindful Self-Compassion Center, he said, these difficult feelings that arise during a self-compassion practice is called backdraft. Think about it, it's like a firefighting term. When you throw open the doors of a house on fire, the oxygen rushes in and the flames rush out. Similarly, when we open our hearts and the love rushes in, our past trauma, pain, and insecurity may rush out. Backdraft isn't a problem. So I just want, the doctors in a similar position like myself to know it's not a problem. It's a sign that the healing process has begun. And suddenly, when I learned to walk again, that was actually the healing process has begun. I can safely say that my healing process started in America. That's why America has a very special place in my heart. And self-compassion can certainly help doctors, not only with disability and chronic illnesses, doctors from around the world who are facing burnout at the moment, which unfortunately has been compounded by the pandemic, to heal from their emotional pain, to not only emotional pain, the physical, mental, spiritual pain from burnout. It's that secret ingredient, the secret sauce.
So let's talk about the Kevin MD article that you wrote, and it's titled "The Unspoken Pandemic in Frontline Healthcare Workers." Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read that article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
Yeah, I decided to write that article because of a personal story that I had. My brother, Andrew, is a doctor in Singapore, and unfortunately in the second wave of the pandemic, like many other doctors around the world, they were deployed in the front line, and so was Andrew. And being his sister, of course, I was concerned that that he might get COVID. And he's a father of 2 young kids, and he was isolated from his family for months. And when we had a conversation on the phone, I could feel his emotional pain. It was very palpable, and he was telling me that he had gotten his affairs in order, and he was telling me that the steps to wearing a PPE, or protective personal equipment, was really, they had to be very vigilant, because one wrong step and they can get COVID. And he was living on edge every day. He was very anxious. He didn't sleep very well. I mean, he was already burnt out before COVID, and this being deployed on the front line and being socially isolated from his family just made the whole burnout, his burnout a lot worse. And he was having insomnia, and I was quite concerned. Then I began to reflect that if my brother Andrew was feeling this way, and I'm sure many other doctors and nurses around the world who are fighting at the front line of the pandemic was feeling the same. And I guess as a pain physician, I'm quite highly intuitive person, so I can feel someone's not physical, as in like, like not just physical pain, like their emotional pain as well, spiritual and mental pain. And I was starting to reflect, I think this is what the frontline healthcare workers had to go through, similar like what Andrew experienced, the social isolation from their family and friends and their community in general. And the fact that some of them, especially where you guys are in the US, you had to treat your colleagues, and sometimes your family members come in with COVID and they die in front of you. And having to look after patients who couldn't even say goodbye to their loved ones and they pass away. And I was just reflecting on vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. Vicarious trauma is a term that I'm very familiar with as a pain physician, because as pain physicians, we see a lot of patients with chronic pain and complex trauma, but inevitably we also tend to kind of absorb the trauma experience in our body as well. And then mentally it affects us, and then we burnt out. There's a very high burnout rate in pain physicians. And I was just thinking, I was just translating my experience as a pain physician in terms of the pain from burnout these frontline healthcare workers had to go
Mm-hmm.
through. And that's how the whole idea behind the article started. And that's why I wrote in the article about the fact that they had, this frontline healthcare workers had to, I guess, endure vicarious trauma, having to witness friends and colleagues die in front of them, literally, and them being socially isolated with no support. And I don't think the hospitals were able to support them because they were probably under the pump as well, right, to deal with the COVID patients. And suddenly burnout was a big issue way before the pandemic. And then the pandemic just really added the extra mental load and emotional and physical and spiritual burnout load on these frontline healthcare workers. And I wrote the article to give them a voice. I felt that they were, I wrote down as the unspoken pandemic because the politicians, they talk about revitalization of the economy, opening the doors and all these things, but the frontline healthcare workers were forgotten. And it's the same here in Australia. Our politicians were exactly the same. Revitalization of economy, opening up, well, most borders, but the frontline healthcare workers are forgotten. And certainly in Sydney, where they're in lockdown at the moment, where there's been a spread of the Delta variant of the virus, and the doctors are certainly feeling it. And there's like about a lot of patients in ICU, and the hospital system is taking the brunt from the COVID patients coming in. And probably the premise behind the whole reason why I wrote the article is to give these healthcare workers a voice. And for us, I guess, who are probably, for not us, like the politicians, to acknowledge that this is the unspoken pandemic and something needs to be done. And that's why I wrote the article.
Now, tell me, what kind of advice did you give your brother and to the other frontline clinicians who may be having similar feelings to him?
What I told my brother, Andrew, was what I told myself years ago when I was learning to walk again and my journey with self-compassion. So I told Andrew the exact same thing. It was a new concept for him. He thought it was fluffy, and he thought it was really, he's like, what happened to your sister? But I explained to him the 3 pillars, and I told him to, first of all, the first pillar is mindful awareness. I told Andrew that you have to acknowledge the fact that you're suffering from burnout. And this whole experience you're going through, being isolated from your family, having to deal with, patient after patient and the front line, looking after them. You just have to not acknowledge you are suffering. And that's okay to acknowledge that you're suffering. You don't have to be the Lone Ranger anymore. Not, being afraid to ask for help because, I guess for us doctors, if we ask for help, that means that we're weak or we're incompetent, but that's not. The fact that it's just Lone Ranger programming is something that we've had since we were med students. And I told Andrew, look, you just have to let go of your old programming that, if you don't ask for help, you are not capable. You have to ask for help. You have to ask me for help. I'm your sister. And similarly for, I guess, healthcare workers who are, afraid to ask for help and being Lone Rangers, they can ask their family and friends for help. And it's okay to ask them, if you can't see them face to face, virtually, by telephone, stay connected with them by social media or WhatsApp or anything. And then lastly, self-acceptance will be what I told Andrew, like, you have to accept that you are suffering and then allow and forgive yourself. You can't, you let that patient die in front of you. It's not your fault, telling them to be, that's why I told Andrew to be kind to himself and just move forward and heal. And it's essentially self-compassion allows you to do all that. And that's what my encouragement to healthcare workers out there who are still battling at the front line the pandemic is to practice self-compassion during this unprecedented times. Self-compassion practice doesn't take very long. It only takes 10 seconds. Put your hand on your heart like this. Take 3 deep breaths, 10 seconds. But it could save your marriage, your relationships, your life, and your mental health. And I feel that the sooner or later the world learns about, from self-compassion and discovering this technique, the sooner they can, the world can heal itself.
And how's your brother doing now?
I'm pleased to say that he's doing really well now. He's actually been in the media a lot. He's a gastroenterologist with a very strong interest in irritable bowel syndrome. And here he's really enjoying his life, teaching medical students. That's his other work, is medical education. So he's really back into it. He's enjoying it, even though they're doing it virtually.
Mm-hmm.
And he's back in his job as a gastroenterologist. It's pretty much normal in Singapore now, given that everyone's been vaccinated, and they've opened up their borders internationally as well. So Andrew feels that his life is back to normal.
We're talking to Olivia Ong. She is a pain and rehabilitation medicine physician in Australia. She wrote the Kevin MD article, The Unspoken Pandemic and Frontline Healthcare Workers. Olivia, what's your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
We already own self-compassion. As a result of burnout, and now we're talking about post-COVID stress syndrome, a lot of healthcare workers right now, they're probably coming to grips about what's happening right at this moment and what they went through last year with the pandemic. Some of them, unfortunately, are self-medicating with alcohol and drugs. Relationships are impaired, marriages are breaking down, and worst cases, suicides arise. But as I said, there's a cure, and they already own it. Is this practice of self-compassion. If they're willing to let go of their Lone Ranger programming, they can learn to love and forgive themselves. And certainly I talk a lot about this in my book that I've written called The Heart-Centeredness of Medicine. It'll be launched on the 9th of September this year, which coincides with Are You OK Day in Australia, which essentially is a practice where you ask your colleagues and your friends, your family, are you okay?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a practice, I guess it's a way to check in with one another, whether they are feeling okay. And this is certainly something we can practice in our hospitals with our colleagues or even our family and friends. Are you okay?
And how can people reach you?
So people can reach me on my website on www.drolivialeong.com. I have some free resources about burnout, and if you need more support, there is a way you can reach me through an inquiry form. And another way you can reach me is through ordering my book and having a read, and hopefully learning some heart-based tools can help you recover from burnout. Thank you.
Olivia, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
No problem. Thank you so much.